thank you all for joining us at our 7th annual Free the Seeds event. This is our 2nd time doing a full virtual event and the last time doing a full virtual event. We are really looking forward to being in person with all of you next year. Free the Seeds is a community-based project of Land to Hand Montana, formerly Farm Hands Nourish the Flathead, and it's rooted in building a sustainable and resilient future through real seeds, real food, and real skills. Land to Hand's mission is to build a strong community food system that fosters socially just ways of accessing food, and Free the Seeds provides us an avenue to build that system. While this is a free event, it takes time and money to make it happen. If you'd like to support these efforts, please go to the link that I'm going to put in the chat right now. Finally, we want to thank this year's major sponsors, Box of Rain Organic Gardening Center, who offers gardening supplies and classes in Kalispell, and we'll also link them in the chat. And then also Save Farmland, a new nonprofit based in Whitefish working to preserve farmland. And finally, you, our amazing seed savers who grew and saved seeds for us to package. This year, the majority of the seeds that we gave out were saved in our community. And that's the whole point of this project. It's pretty amazing. We are really excited that Nathan Christianson is here from Raven Ridge Farm. He's going to do a seed starting workshop that will focus on timing, equipment, techniques, and basic observational skills to help you grow strong and healthy plants from seed. Starting seeds in your garden in Northwest Montana is the first step towards having a successful garden. Many types of vegetables prefer to be started indoors before being transplanted outside or in a greenhouse. Nathan will take you on a step-by-step journey, giving you tools to set up your own seed starting operation. These tools and tips have been developed and refined at his farm, Raven Ridge, over the last 7 years, helping it become a highly successful market garden here in the Flathead Valley. Nathan is the co-owner and operator of Raven Ridge Farms in Kalispell. After a few seasons working as field hands, he and his partner, Cassidy Daly, became the newest owners of Raven Ridge Farm in 2017. Together, their journey from being seasonal farm interns to farm owners, earning a year-round living from seasonal production, is a testament to their tireless work ethic and their patience to grow a small business on their own from the ground up. Nestled between the Stillwater and Flathead Rivers, east of Kalispell, Raven Ridge Farm grows seasonal vegetables and plant starts on 1.5 acres using no-till and regenerative practices. Nathan and his crew grow a staggering amount of high-quality vegetables on their small market garden. The food grown goes out weekly to more than 100 CSA families, 2 farmers markets, and their driveway self-serve farm stand. We're super honored and grateful to have Nathan here today. So Nathan, take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Gretchen, for the introduction and everything with Free the Seeds. Yeah, I'm Nathan Christianson, and I'm gonna take you guys on a journey in regards to seed starting. We're gonna set the bar pretty high. We're gonna aim for, growing plants in just, with the most awesome of our abilities, okay? So we'll get going here. Next slide. Gretchen's controlling my slides for me. All right, so this is just a little outline of everything that we're gonna cover in this hour and a half that I have with y'all. So we're gonna go through some advantages to seed starting, kind of build our intent and what we're trying to do. We'll go through the correct containers and pot sizes and just the different vessels that we can grow our plant babies in. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about potting mix, nursery spaces, and I'll just mention now that when I say the term nursery space, this can really be anything. This is anywhere that you're growing your vegetables. In my context, I'm broadcasting live from our 600 square foot greenhouse, and we call it a nursery. So whenever you hear me say nursery, I'm just talking about wherever that location is where you're growing your plant starts. We'll talk about watering and some tips with watering, potting up, which is moving plants from one small cell into a bigger cell. And then I'll conclude talking a little bit about seeds. So in that picture there, we got some tomato plants growing in a 4-inch pot and some rainbow chard. But I'm ready for the next slide, Gretchen. Okay, so some advantages to seed starting. Okay, so when making this presentation, the first thing that came to my mind when I was thinking about why is it important to start our own seeds, and the reason is for season extension. We live in such a cold climate that we really can't waste any time when it comes to trying to fully optimize our garden. So what we can do is around now, this time of year, when there's still snow on the ground, we can start our seeds so that come April or May, whenever our garden beds or containers are ready, we'll have nice, large, healthy plants ready to be planted. Instead of waiting until April or May to begin our seeds, at which point we would just be wasting too much time. And in our, cold climate, we just really can't afford that. Another advantage to seed starting is the increased germination and growing our plants in a controlled environment so that we can plant them in a more full bed in more favorable conditions. Sorry about that. We can outpace our weeds. So we can outpace our weeds because our baby plants can be growing in our nursery. And in the meantime, we can be preparing our beds outside. We can stale seed bed, which is essentially germinating and killing weeds in preparation to plant our cash crops. Another way we can outpace our weeds is by planting large, healthy plants that create a canopy shading the soil so that weeds that can germinate, they cannot thrive. So another advantage is scheduled successions. So if you like eating something like butterhead lettuce, well, it's no fun just to plant butterhead lettuce once, eat it, and then it's done for the rest of the year. What you can do is you can plant on starting butterhead lettuce every week or two in your nursery space so that on a scheduled time frame, you can just enjoy the harvest of that butterhead lettuce all summer long. And finally, probably the most important advantage to seed starting is to take care of our microbial life. So we can think about roots as a coral reef. A coral reef harbors life, protects life, and feeds millions of organisms. The roots of our plants are very much the same way. The area around the roots of our plants is called the rhizosphere. This is where much of the interaction takes place between the plant and the soil that it's growing in. So if we think about direct sowing seeds, such as carrots or arugula, some of these crops we have to direct sow, but you plant them in the ground and it takes a couple weeks worth of watering before the plants germinate and they create a root mass. Well, during that time, the microorganisms in your soil really don't have a safe harbor to live. So on our farm, we try to transplant our plant starts into the field as often and as much as possible. We start our spinach indoors. We start our beets indoors. A lot of crops that many people might just want to sow the seeds out in the garden beds and roll with that. We really believe in the benefits of transplanting, which is taking these plant starts and putting them out into the garden. We're going to start off talking about flats, containers, buckets, bags. Where are we going to grow these plant starts? Well, there's many options these days, and it really doesn't matter which option you choose. What's more important is the size, and you need to choose a size based on the soil volume required and how long that plant will live in the cell. So, a lot of words there. I have a couple examples of some cells and pots that we use, and I can give you kind of some tips on what crops would work in those cells and why. I'll start with tomatoes and peppers because I believe those are some big popular ones for many home gardeners. And I'll kind of just show you how we do that. So tomatoes grow indoors for weeks, and when they're finally ready to be planted, they're going to spend the duration of the growing season out in your garden or in your tunnel or in wherever you're growing those. So what we like to do is we like to start tomatoes in these large open flats. These are called mama trays or 1020s. They're 10 inches by 20 inches. And these are really nice to get a bunch of seeds started. What we do is we fill this tray with soil, and then we use just a little piece of metal or a ruler or a wooden block or something, and we score lines into the soil. And how deep to do that depends on the size of the seed. Typically twice as deep to 3 times as deep, versus how the size of the seed is how far you want to go. And these work really nicely because you're not wasting a lot of space and you can grow a lot of food in this. Now, some of you don't need to plant 200 tomato plants. This tray works great for combining different types of vegetables. You can very easily have 1 or 2 lines of tomato plants, 1 or 2 lines of pepper plants, some broccoli. It doesn't really matter. In each of those rows, you may have 10 to 15 seeds, but it's a great way to start them. Now, after a couple weeks, they've grown out of their room, they're getting larger, they're too close to each other, they need more space. So something like a 4-inch pot is really nice for putting a tomato into or putting a pepper into. And we really like doing this, again, for the long-standing crops. For crops that are not going to spend very much time in your nursery or your growing space, maybe only 2 or 3 weeks, a crop like bok choy or head lettuce, some of those crops, it might make more sense to use a cell flat. This particular cell flat has 128 cells in it, so room for potentially, 128 heads of lettuce. These come in different sizes. There's cell flats that have 50 individual cells, some that have 72s, etc. So these work really great for crops that are only going to be in there for a little bit of time and then are going to move out on their own. So some advantages to these cell flats is that they use much less soil. They have nice holes for drainage, so overwatering, they're rather forgivable, and they're sort of reusable. They are cheap, thin plastic. On our farm, we get 3 to 5 years out of one flat. That's how much we can use it before it sort of just breaks. And we use these plastic trays because on our scale, growing tens of thousands of plants, we can't really afford to grow them all in their own individual hemp fiber cells. So maybe on a smaller scale as a grower, I definitely would prefer to use something that's compostable or of natural origin, but work with what you got. These plastic ones have worked well for us. So in that picture there, we have some eggplant. It looks like there's eggplants that are living in 6-pack size trays, which is a nice size for a kind of intermediate sort of crop like that. So, okay. So we have our pots, and now we need to fill them with something.
Hey, Nathan,
So,
really sorry.
yep.
Someone just had a quick question and I
Yep.
was on what you were talking about. So sorry to interrupt. Okay.
No
What
problem.
about block sowing?
Sowing into soil blocks.
Yes.
Yeah, sowing into soil blocks is great. that is a really nice technique that doesn't really require any of these plastic trays, where you can essentially use a mold with some wet soil and create little cubes where you can sow the seeds. Those work really nicely. I don't have any personal experience in using them, although I know it's a successful method for many people. So if you're down to do soil blocks, go for it. Okay, I'm going to move on to potting mix now. So with potting mix, there's many options. You can acquire your own ingredients and make it yourself. You can buy Miracle Grow bags from Home Depot, or you can find some other alternatives. And it really doesn't matter. What you really just need to make sure of is that a few qualities and components and requirements are met, because we are creating life with these seeds and we want to set them up for success. So I think it's cool to roll with any potting mix that's vetted, and if you've had luck with it or you know people who use it, then that's totally good. But we need to have decent drainage. We need water to be able to flow through the potting mix when it's in a cell or in a tray, although we don't want it to leach out too quickly. So it needs to, the balance of that, be able to retain some water. It needs a somewhat balanced pH. There needs to be some fertilizer or nutrient, and it needs to have some aeration, meaning some air needs to be able to flow through it. So it's really everything a plant needs to begin its life in, a tiny little cell. So we just need to make sure that those boxes are checked. I have a little recipe there from a famous Canadian market gardener, and we have used this before in the past, and it's worked great. 3 parts peat moss, 2 parts perlite. Perlite is a volcanic ash sort of mineral that helps with aeration. The peat moss is sort of an acidic, naturally occurring thing that is really the body of most potting mix. 2 parts compost, 1 part garden soil. It's always a good idea to introduce some of the native soil into your baby plants so they can kind of become familiar with that. The blood meal in there is a high in nitrogen fertilizer, and the agricultural lime is calcium carbonate, which is like limestone. So that's likely there to help balance the pH, where the blood meal and the peat moss is rather acidic. The agricultural lime is a bit more basic. So we're very fortunate to live in this part of Montana, where we have a local business that sells potting mix. Pico, down on the west shore of Flathead Lake in Big Arm, actually mines peat moss out of a bog near Lake Mary Ronan. He dries the peat moss and mixes and sells his own potting mix. And I know farmers that drive 10 hours from different states to come pick up potting mix. So we're very fortunate to have that resource locally available. Now, we buy large bags of his potting mix from Pico, but you can also buy a smaller, I think maybe 40-pound bag or so for maybe a smaller scale. Box of Rain is a nice grower supply store in Kalispell that sells some other types of potting mix, including Pico, I believe, but they've got some options. And as far as sourcing some local compost, Dirt Rich, a business in Columbia Falls, has very high quality compost that we buy a lot of for our fields every year. And so those are just a couple sources if you're interested in improving your potting mix or maybe making your own. One thing, if you choose to go down the road of making your own potting mix, is to keep in mind that excess is just as bad as deficiency. I don't know if it's a scarcity mindset of a human being, but when we lack confidence in something, maybe we just want to add more and more and more. And I can tell you that that is a bad idea. So keep in mind that potting mix is really just a balance of different ingredients and their relationship they have with each other. And so don't go down the road of throwing buckets and buckets of blood meal into your potting mix. Just keep it conservative and play it safe. A couple tips I have about potting mix, and I'm speaking on behalf of Pico's potting mix as well as some other potting mix that we've tried before, but it is very hydrophobic, meaning that it does not want to absorb water that easily. So what we recommend doing is pouring your potting mix into a bucket or a container or a wheelbarrow and adding some water and mixing it. Because if you were to put some dry potting mix in this 4-inch pot and you were to water it, the potting mix would not want to absorb the water. So mixing it ahead of time is really going to set those seeds up for success. How much water is too much water to have in your potting mix? Well, you should test it. So once you've stirred it around a bit, if you can squeeze the potting mix and water is dripping out, that is too wet. You need to add some more potting mix to dry it out a little bit. It should be very wet. It should be on the verge of dripping, but not quite dripping, if that makes sense. Just another note on potting mix is properly filling your cell flats and your pots. So if you go down the route of a cell flat or even a 6-pack, there's a tendency that the corners of the tray or the 6-pack receives less potting mix than the middle. So just make sure that you work that potting mix in, and always leave a little bit of room in the cell. So don't fill the potting mix up to the brim. Leave maybe a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch, depending on the type of the cell, where the potting mix is below that. And that's going to allow you, when you go to water, it's going to create a little bit of a well. It will collect the water and it can let it soak through at its own rate. So again, even if the potting mix is wet, if you fill it up to the brim, it's going to take a lot of water, a lot of watering for it to penetrate, because most of it's going to be rolling over the edges. So just, filling it up just below the brim is going to create a nice little well there. So ready for the next slide, Gretchen.
We have 2 questions. You want me to ask them quick?
Okay, let's take some questions.
Okay. Heidi asks, I bought store-bought local potting mix, or my store-bought local potting mix turns moldy consistently. Is that a concern to my starts?
Yeah, absolutely. It should not be moldy. There's a possibility that it is not a result of the potting mix, but could be a result of too much watering or a lack of airflow. So I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But if your plant starts are growing somewhere where it's really stagnant and kind of like musty almost, like you can just tell that the air is not flowing, especially this time of year, then you can often run into some challenges with mold. Now, if your potting mix is getting moldy and what I just mentioned is not the case, then I think that I would just find a different potting mix. But yeah, it should not be moldy. Sometimes potting mix can have a little bit of like green algae growing on it, which I don't see as anything that would be detrimental. So if it is a green kind of like algae, that's just because it's just lush and moist. So yeah, that's all I can think about that.
Great. One more question from Corey. They want to know, what size are the buckets in your recipe? 1 gallon, 5 gallon?
Good question. I think in this case, I reckon it's a 5-gallon bucket. More importantly, I think it's the, parts to the total. Although looking at the 1 cup of blood meal and 1/2 cup of lime, which is a specific measurement, I believe that they're 5-gallon buckets. So on the picture on the left is just some of our potting mix after it's been wet. It really has a dark color, and it's, it's it's well saturated, but it's not at the point where it's dripping water's dripping when you squeeze it. Picture on the right is just a fun picture. Those are the bags of potting mix that we received from Pico. As I mentioned, it is available in smaller portions. All right, so now I'm going to talk about the seeding room. And as I've previously mentioned, in my context, I'm talking about my nursery, but for you, this may be a closet or a shelf in your kitchen or your basement. And again, it really doesn't matter. As long as you can control a few growing conditions, you can have a lot of success with really, low tech kind of setups. So I have just a few little stats here, keeping the temperature between 64 and 73 degrees during the daytime. Most crops are going to be very happy about that. Some of your peppers and tomatoes might prefer to live in a warmer environment, or if you're trying to sprout ginger or turmeric or something more tropical, then obviously you would have to increase those temperatures, but that's a decent rule of thumb. Now, I will talk in a later slide about how seeds need a higher temperature to germinate than they do to grow. So that 64 degrees at night, if that's in your house or something, then I think that's a really achievable temperature because you're already heating the space you live in. I think if you're in a plastic filmed greenhouse like this or a garage, don't get too caught up on that temperature. And I'll talk about that more in the following slide. So you need to maintain some sort of humidity, and this can be, some greenhouse plastic over your shelf where you have your plant starts. Panda film is sort of what they use. It's like a black, it's black on one side and white on the other, but essentially having like a plastic material can trap the humidity. Mylar is like space blankets. That helps trap humidity and has some benefits in regards to reflection of light. And then I'll talk about it more, but little humidity domes can really help with that as well. What I think is really important, especially this time of year when most of us are starting our seeds or beginning to think about starting our seeds, is the air circulation. This time of year, although we have quite a bit of daylight, it's rather gray. And so we have a tendency to watering the plants more than we really need to. And so by having some air circulation, you're really gonna set yourself up for more success with fungal issues and keeping those plants not keeping them from being wilty. There's just a picture of the room I'm currently in from a couple years ago, but you can see we've got some shelving and our tables, and we heat with a pellet wood stove. It's all very, very low tech and pretty cheap to put together. And, we can still yield really solid results. So a couple more things about the seeding room. We'll talk about lights. So if you're growing in your house somewhere, you 100% need to add some supplemental lights. Even out here in a clear plastic greenhouse, we use lights a little bit to help improve our plants this time of year. So ideally, vegetable plants are getting 14 to 16 hours of sunlight a day. As of March 1st, we crossed the 11-hour mark, and I believe we're gaining 2 or 3 minutes a day. However, 11 hours of daylight, it's pretty gray. Lights really go a long way. When it comes to choosing the lights, there's many options, and it ultimately comes down to how much money you want to spend. Beginning, on the low end of the budget would be just like the most basic T12 fluorescent shop lights. Those work absolutely fine, and they're going to be sort of the most affordable options. all the way up to full spectrum LED lights, where you're going to spend a few $100s or more. They're more energy efficient and they last much longer. But again, it's sort of up to what you're interested in. You know, I don't know if you can see these, but we use something called Sun Blaster. They're T5 lights. They're fluorescent and they last for 2.5 years. So 12 hours a day for 2.5 years, they'll last. The light bulb and the ballast, I believe, were like $40. The ballast will last you much longer, and you can just replace the bulb. So not too expensive, but I highly recommend it, especially if you're growing tomatoes or some of these crops that take a long time and you need to start them, you know, now, or even maybe you've already started them. But it's a really nice thing that your plants will appreciate. The biggest tip I can give you with lights would be to make sure your lights are pretty close to your plants. There's a term we use called legginess, which is when a plant doesn't look proportional. Maybe it has like 3 or 4 inches of stem with a small little point of growth at the top. It just doesn't look right. All vegetable plants that are strong, you know, seedlings should look rather proportional, excuse me. And oftentimes people have their lights too far away, and this causes the plants to stretch for the light. So you can get lights within 4 inches of your plants. Keep in mind, if you're using like a sodium halide light, some lights give off a lot of heat. So just put your hand there, and if it feels like it's burning your hand, it's probably going to burn your plants. LED lights give off very little heat. Our T5 fluorescent lights that we use can be pretty close to the plants and are rather harmless. So we keep all of our lights on chains, and the light is attached to the chain with a little S hook. So we can very easily just move up and down the chain links depending. As the plant grows, we can move them up a little bit, or if we realize we're too far away, we can lower them. So, ready for the next slide?
There's one question about light bulbs.
Okay, let's hear it.
Sam asked, are the bulbs just regular fluorescent or special for growing?
With lights, you know, you can use really any shop light. They all lights give off some beneficial wavelengths. Some of the fancier lights are what they call full spectrum light, because plants, they like blue light and they like red light. So you can spend more money for a light that's going to be more optimal. But the reality is we've used T12 old crusty shop lights for years with no problem. I've tried like the cool light and the warm, because they have these different, you know, range of light, the different ones, like if you go to the hardware store, and it really doesn't matter from our experiences that it's good enough. So it's not something to overthink. I mean, if you want to get more into it, you can look at full spectrum lights, which kind of give a wider range of wavelengths for the plants. So the seeding room continued. Okay, heat mats. So this I'm kind of going to link back up with that 64-degree nighttime temperature. It's much cheaper and easier to use a heat mat than it is to warm a space, especially if it's not in your house, to 64 degrees. So the temperature that plants need to germinate is much higher than what they need to live in. So in our context at our farm, we start almost everything on a heat mat, especially the tomatoes and those warm, temperature-loving crops. Because if you look at the back of your tomato seed packet, it might say 76 degrees to germinate. Well, don't try and heat a space to 76 degrees. That's very difficult. What you can do is get a heat mat and germinate them on the heat mat. And then once they're germinated, plants will happily live in much cooler ambient air temperatures. We heat our nursery to 50 degrees at night. There's some corners of our nurseries that gets down into the low 40s. And it's really okay. What is the most crucial time is when you have sown those seeds and they have not germinated yet. Do keep in mind, if you add heat mats, your watering schedule will change dramatically because your soil will be drying out from the bottom up. So just be aware of that if you use heat mats, that you really can't trust just looking at the surface and think that, oh, the surface looks moist, the roots 2 inches down are moist as well. On a heat mat, it's likely not the case. I highly recommend just sticking your finger in and seeing if it's dry or wet down where most of the roots are. So just something to keep in mind. The picture there of those Vivo Sun heat mats, those are pretty cheap heat mats. I think they're like 20 or 30 bucks, and they're 4 feet long. So the 10-inch by 20-inch trays, you can comfortably fit 4 of those on the heat mat, which is, I think, worth the price of buying those. Some of those lower end heat mats, they don't have a temperature setting. You just plug it in and go. So be aware of that. If you want to spend a little bit more money, you can buy a thermostatically controlled heat mat where you place a probe in the soil, and on the heat mat, you can adjust to the direct temperature that you want the heat mat to warm that soil to. Another affordable option and a good little tip is to use these clear humidity domes. So these are UV treated clear plastic. I think you can get like a 10-pack for relatively cheap. And this is gonna really help maintain that humidity and also help with that greenhouse warming effect. And so you're gonna be able to sort of passively heat the plants living under this dome. And they fit the standard 10-20 tray. 90% of the trays that you're gonna buy are the standard dimension, regardless of how many cells it has or whatever. And so these really fit nicely. I will say, if you use these and it's a really warm sunny day, I might recommend taking them off, because you don't want to just fry and suffocate the plants on a warm sunny day, especially if you're using this in addition to being inside a clear plastic greenhouse. That's like double greenhouse effect, and it's too much. But this is just another little tip that can go a long way. And these should really, some of these that we have are like more than 10 years old, so they'll last a very long time. So yeah, ready for the next one, Gretchen? All right, so a little bit about watering. And this is kind of a silly thing to talk about, because you could read every book on earth about greenhouse production and watering, especially manually watering with a human being, and it's very difficult. Many of us overwater plants and drown them. Many of us underwater plants and they, dry out. It's truly an observation and intuition based task. So I always say learn through experiences. But with that said, there's a couple tips that I can give you. Some things to consider. Different tray types need different amounts of water. So the 128 cell tray, these little cells cannot hold very much water. Whereas some of the large open flat trays, there's a larger mass of soil there, so it can hold water longer. If you have multiple trays of different sizes and some trays of the same size, it could be beneficial to group similar size trays together, so that when you're watering and you get to a particular style of tray, you know how to adjust your watering needs. Think about the location of where your plant starts are growing and living. Are they living like right next to a fan or a baseboard heater? you should be able to kind of map the airflow and heat flow in your growing space. In my context, I know where the cold spots are in my nursery. I know that the plants that are right in front of the stove are going to dry out sooner, so they need more watering. Crops in the corner need less watering. So just be aware. If you have a fan that's blasting down on your crops, they're going to dry out sooner. Just kind of being spatially aware of how air flows and how heat flows through your space. And if you're a gardening nerd like I am, you probably check the weather quite a bit. I check the weather multiple times a day, multiple sources. They're all wrong, but I can kind of come up with some general trends. So if we're anticipating some really gray, cloudy weather for a few days in a row, let's think about backing off on our watering, because our plants aren't going to be needing as much water, and their soil is not going to be drying up very quickly. And contrasting that, if you're growing plants for fall and they're little seedlings in the heat of the summer, you may be watering them multiple times a day. So just being aware of a couple things like that can really save some heartache of killing some plant babies. Yeah, there's just a picture. We really like using, I'm holding it here, this Wonder Waterer. It's attached to a garden hose and you can put an adjustable valve on it. But what's really great about it is that it has many holes that are very, very small. And so it's a very gentle nozzle versus something with large holes that gushes water out and can disturb your seeds too much. So some more tips. So be aware of the watering can you may use, or if you are using a nozzle, of just how much water it's putting out. Some of these plants are very, very small, and some of the cells that they're living in are very, very small. I would say generally, we have a tendency to overwater, to water too much. So I'm always trying to pull the reins back on people because they love their plants so much, they want to water them over and over again. And especially this time of year, we do not want to be doing that. So mid-morning watering is a kind of safe bet. It's been a few hours since the coldest part of the day. The sun is up, or at least it's brighter outside than at nighttime, and we're still quite a few hours away from the sun setting. So this time of year, if we're watering once a day, I think maybe around 11 a.m. is a really great time. You really don't want your plants going into the nighttime with water droplets on them. They are not going to be able to shake that off, and it does affect their stomata, some biological things. But what can really happen is that we have mold issues. There's something called dampening off, and this happens when the base of the plant essentially withers away and dies because it was too wet for too long. So a mid-morning water is a safe bet to follow. And also maybe limiting watering duties to one person. We've all heard the term too many cooks in the kitchen. This is true for watering because we all have different perceptions of reality, and our observations might be a little different. And sometimes, whether it's your spouse or partner who's watering, who's sharing the watering duties, you guys might have different ideas of what plants need. Having the same person water every day will help with just observing, how are the plants the last time I watered them? How are they looking now? It's just easier to keep one person on the watering train. So another important thing, and it may not be in all of our control, but water temperature. If you can water your plants with lukewarm water, that will really help minimize the stress of their lives. So just something to keep in mind. We water out of our well that's 53 degrees. So we're pretty much throwing buckets of cold ice water on our plants every day. It's not ideal, it's okay. But if you're on a smaller scale and you're just filling a watering can in your kitchen sink, some lukewarm water can really be beneficial to your plants. And just a reminder, summer watering's, much more forgiving because it's so warm. They just need water. We water 4 or 5 times a day here in the summer in our nursery. It just sort of depends. Most of us are growing crops inside for during the springtime. So if you are growing seedlings in the summertime, you're just going to need to water a lot more. So we watered our.
Okay, I had one
Yep.
question. Sorry,
Okay.
that just came in. If you have a water softener, is it a problem for seed starting?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I would say that generally it's probably okay. I mean, if you're softening your water and you're drinking it, I think your plants can drink it. I think it'll be okay. I don't see any major issue with that. I don't have experience firsthand with that, but I don't see a problem. I'm going to move on to potting up. So, potting up. Transferring seedlings from small cells to bigger ones. I touched on this a little bit earlier when I was talking about the different trays and cells, but I can briefly just kind of cover a few things. We do this with tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, and our very early season broccoli, cauliflower, and cabbage. The reason we pot up our early season brassicas, which are the broccoli, cabbage, and cauliflowers, is because when I pot them up into a 6-pack, that's going to give me really large, huge plants to go plant in the ground in mid-April, when we typically plant our early brassicas. Now, that's pushing the season. We still have lots of frosts that time of year, but by planting a large plant in the ground, theoretically, and what we've observed is that they are ready for harvest a little bit earlier. And in the early season, the soil in your garden is much colder. So by planting a tiny little broccoli plant in April, it's going to take a really long time for it to be ready for harvest. Whereas by planting a much larger broccoli plant in April, you're kind of giving it a little bit of a head start. So we do not pot up those brassicas during the main growing season because the soil's warmed up and we don't mind planting them a little bit smaller. And as I mentioned before, certain crops don't get potted up because they just don't spend enough time in your nursery to justify the labor that it takes to pot up. So in that picture there, it looks like broccoli and cauliflower that was likely started in a mama tray. Maybe there were 200 broccolis in here, maybe 12 or 13 rows with 15 seeds in each row. And then after a few weeks, they get a little crowded. And then what we do is we pull them apart and we pot them up. So there's some benefits to do this. We're giving them extra root space. We don't want them to get root bound, and we want them to continue growing. If their roots don't have space to expand and be where they want to be, then they're essentially kind of choked out and suffocated and will be stunted. It's also a refresh of nutrients. You're putting in fresh potting mix that has your compost and your fertilizer and all those sorts of things. And you have the opportunity to high grade. So maybe for many of you, you only need to plant 5 or so tomato plants, but in your initial seeding, you seeded 15. Some look stronger than others. So when you go to pot up, it's an opportunity to high grade and pick the nicest ones to meet whatever the number is that you need for your space. Another benefit of potting up is that it buys you time. So many of us start our seeds way too early. I'm sure some of us have zucchini growing and crops that are warm weather crops, and here we are like pretty much the first week of March. So by taking a tomato plant that is in here and it's huge, but it's still, below freezing outside, I can transplant this into a 6-inch pot or a gallon pot, and that's going to give it more time. So in a slow spring, as I say, in some emergency situations, potting up will just buy you some more time. Beware. So when we have a little clump of small broccoli plants that we want to pot up and move them into a bigger house, we are going to break their roots. They have thousands of roots, many of which we cannot see with our eyes. And so breaking the roots is inevitable. But one thing we can do is just be very careful. If you think about a good bird hunting dog, when they retrieve the fowl, they don't bite too hard. They have a soft mouth. That's the same way we can think about our hands when handling these delicate plants, is to be very gentle. Holding them by the base of their stem, where the stem comes out of the soil. That is the strongest part of the plant and a good place to hold on to. When we go to plant them up, we want to make sure that we make a nice big hole that will accept the plant roots, okay? And a common issue that I see is people not planting their seedlings deep enough. And this is in regards to potting up, but this can also transfer for when it's time to go plant your plants in the garden. So some seedlings that are leggy or too tall, when you go to pot them up, that's an opportunity to give that plant another shot by burying the legginess. So you can bury a plant, its entire stem below the soil, as long as you keep the point of growth, which is different for most plants, but generally it's at the top of the plant where the plant grows from. You can keep that above the soil. So you could, in theory, take a long stringy broccoli, bury it very deep to the point where there's just like 1 or 2 inches sticking out and the point of growth is exposed. And that broccoli plant could very well have a second shot at being very successful. Whereas if you take a leggy plant and you pot it up and it remains leggy, you're not really fixing that issue at all. So oftentimes we'll bury plants rather deep. The cotyledons, which are the first true leaves on vegetables, oftentimes we'll bury the cotyledons and plant it even deeper because we just want a strong, sturdy base. And that's going to translate to a healthier vegetable once it's planted outside in your garden. All plants experience transplant shock. They pretty much just had like the worst day of their lives, being ripped out of their cozy home and separated. And so what transplant shock is essentially the plant trying to recover from its surgery, much like us humans. When that happens, I recommend keeping the plants out of the direct sunlight after they're potted up for a couple days. If it's cloudy outside, it really doesn't matter, but avoiding that direct sunlight will just kind of take it easy and let them rest. With transplant shock, they'll look very, very wilted, like you killed them, but oftentimes they pop back up.
We have one question here from Heidi. Is there any plant that you couldn't or that you can't or shouldn't bury it when potting up?
Generally, I would say no. If you can visualize what the cotyledons are on crops, if they're healthy cotyledons, so like a pepper plant will have its first true leaves and then it'll continue growing. Those true leaves will either stay nice and healthy. Sometimes they wither away and die. Oftentimes cotyledons on tomato plants die. That's okay. But I think if you have nice, healthy cotyledon, like the first true leaves, and it's time for you to pot up, I think just bury the plant just below the cotyledons, and those cotyledons can stay above the soil. So I think you don't always need to plant extremely deep. It's kind of just an opportunity, if it was leggy, to give it a second chance. But generally speaking, I mean, we're planting our stuff pretty deep, and that seems to work really well for us. So, any more questions? So after potting up, we've waited a few more weeks and we have delicious, beautiful looking plant starts that are ready to be put into the garden. So hardening off, or as I like to call horticulture, is a period of time when we're transitioning our plants from their cozy nursery growing space, or in your warm kitchen on that shelf, to the realities of the outdoors in Montana. So if we do this abruptly, that's a major shock to the plant system. They'll experience transplant shock, being planted out into the ground, and it's much more brutal out there. And so you can actually kill a lot of plants when it's time to go put them into the ground. So if you have the time and you're really trying to set the bar high here and, you know, be an A+ gardener, hardening off is a pretty simple thing to do that's going to ensure your plants are more resilient. So what we want to do is gradual is best. So what we do at our farm is we have some pallets outside this front door, just out on the ground. And a couple days before the plants are scheduled to be put into the ground, we'll take them from the warm nursery out onto the pallets. And they'll still be watered regularly because we're already have our hoses over here, but they're experiencing sunlight for the first time, not in a protected space, wind, etc. So if you can, maybe don't put them outside for an entire day, but maybe the first day, move them outside for a couple hours and then bring them back in. And maybe the second day you can leave them outside overnight. It really just depends. On our scale, we're just moving so many plants, we don't want to go back and forth. So these plants will live on the pallets for a couple days. You can see in the top picture, we have some hoops because we don't want to crush the plants, because at nighttime, we're still putting row cover over them, which is just a lightweight cloth material, sort of like a frost blanket, because we want to nurture them a little bit. We're not completely just cold turkey shutting them off. It's a gradual process. And then we go to plant. When you go to plant, Kelp Meal is a really nice nutrient, and you can find it at local grow stores or maybe like at CHS or something. Make sure you buy water-soluble Kelp Meal, because there's some granular Kelp Meal that is meant as a soil additive that doesn't dissolve as readily. But the Kelp Meal has B vitamins and other micronutrients that sort of aid in the repair of the plant. And we've seen really profound differences. You can apply the Kelp Meal either with like a watering can when you plant it, or you could, you know, when you're planting, you pull out the broccoli plant, you could soak its roots in like a bucket of Kelp Meal for a couple seconds and then put it in the ground. But I really believe in hardening off. I think it's really important. You know, plants that are under stress are not going to do well. They're gonna bolt or go to seed, and you're gonna be left wondering, like, what happened to this plant? It has flowers now. And I think this is a really crucial step that can ensure the success of your plants. It's likely that when you go to plant them, they're gonna be a little wilty for a day or two, and that's totally normal. Again, we're just trying to, you know, use all the tools we have to ensure their success. Choosing the right seed. So I'm not a seed expert, and I know some people who did some Zoom classes are seed people, so I'm not going to get into too much detail, but I can guide you guys in the right direction. A couple tools we have is the USDA Plant Hardiness Zone, and what that is a geographic map of the United States, and you can essentially, well, as of 2012, you can actually zoom in, and it's pretty accurate. And what it does is it categorizes the location that you're in based on the average minimum temperature that area may see in a year. And this may not seem as relevant for annual plants. Oftentimes perennials like your fruit trees or certain flowers and stuff will be rated to a certain zone, meaning they can survive a winter this cold. However, with the plant hardiness zone, there's some affiliated last frost dates and first frost dates, which here in Montana can be kind of a joke because a couple years ago we had a frost on the 4th of July. But it's a nice starting spot, just seeing what that date is. And when you go look at the back of your seed packets, oftentimes they try to kind of get you going in the right direction as far as timing goes, saying, sow indoors 3 weeks before last frost. Well, I think that's a general rule of thumb, and rolling with that can definitely work for you. If you're going to be planting things indoors, like in a high tunnel or a greenhouse or a hoop house, there's a little wiggle room because you have this artificial structure that's helping to extend your season a little bit. But generally, most of us in the Flathead Valley have about 100 frost-free days. Some of y'all out in Marion or something may roll your eyes, or in the foothills of the Swans. But generally speaking, valley floor, most of us are about 100 frost-free days. And so when you're going to pick the varieties of tomato plants that you want to grow, maybe take note of what that days to maturity number is. And I would say be conservative and err on the side of 70-day tomatoes instead of 120-day tomatoes, because at 120 days, you're sort of rolling the dice on if they'd even ripen in time. So that's just a little tip there. The days to maturity, the DTM, is what the seed packet might say. That is the days to maturity starting at the day that it was planted outside. So not when it started in your nursery. Direct sown seeds are a little different, but 70-day tomato is typically 70 days from when you plant it. And obviously greenhouses change that, or how warm or cold your soil is when you plant it changes that. But just a couple thoughts there. We prefer to use certified organic seed at our farm, and I encourage all of you to also use certified organic seed when you can. We have some great local and regional seed companies and seed cooperatives, and they're doing good work on varieties that do well in our climate. So, they're breeding seed and saving seed year to year and developing varieties that can really handle our short growing season. And so I think going with triple divide seed or good seed company could be a great option. For us on our larger scale, where we're buying thousands and thousands of dollars worth of seed, many commercial growers use high mowing seeds or Johnny's seeds. Farmers, we're growing the food to feed people, and so we're choosing the varieties that do well. So high mowing, Johnny's, and then the local companies, I would recommend going with something like that rather than maybe the Home Depot seed rack with some of those seed companies that aren't as vetted. That's just my personal opinion. So wrapping this all up, why this all matters. So not only do we want to feed ourselves, but we want to feed ourselves well. Not all vegetables that we eat are created equal as far as nutrients. Much of this depends on the state of the soil that we're growing our food in, but it really begins at the indoor level when you start your seeds, because a strong, healthy plant start is going to turn into ultimately a strong, healthy plant. If you're not nailing the basics on growing strong plant starts, it's going to be really hard for those crops to reach maturity and reach their optimal level of nutrition, just because if they're under stress and not doing well, then their relationship on the soil and the microbial biology in the soil can be thrown a little off. And so a lot of this information may have been way more than you guys wanted to hear, but we're kind of trying to aim for the stars here on a lot of this stuff. And a lot of it may not be relevant to some of you, but if you can take some pieces from it and roll with it in your own context, I really think you'll see some benefits. As gardeners, the nursery and starting seeds is just one aspect of the process. We have to wear many hats. And so these low tech kind of situations and setups that I've shared with you can really produce some high level results. So this concludes my presentation. If we have a little bit of time, I guess, Gretchen, if people have some questions, we can do some Q&A.
We have a couple questions here. Kelsey asks, what seeds do you currently have planted?
Ooh, good question. So we have started quite a few. My internet's pretty grainy. Otherwise, I would just take you on a tour because I'm here in the nursery. But we have our peppers have just germinated today. They were sown about a week ago. Our peppers are about, or excuse me, our tomatoes are about 1 inch tall. We have beets that have germinated. We like to transplant our beets into one of our big hoop houses, and we end up being able to harvest beets in May, which is pretty cool because, you know, starting beets from seed, you know, sowing them directly outdoors in April or May, you know, it's a long time until you can enjoy beets. So, you know, we really do start so much stuff indoors. We have spinach that's germinated, and let's see, some more of our flowers have popped as well. We grow a few flowers just for our own well-being.
Another attendee asked, do you have any affordable suggestions for hoops or for row covers?
So, you know, locally, I don't know of any really affordable options for the row covers. You know, a couple companies like Johnny's Seeds, they also have a wide array of different growing supplies, and you can find row covers on there. There's a company out of the Midwest called Nolts, Nolts, and you can buy some pretty affordable row cover from them. The big issue with row cover is shipping because it's comes on a large roll, and things are very expensive right now. And so I don't know of any local options, but the most affordable option for row cover would be from Nolts. In regards to hoops, I know Plantland sells some hoop house kits. Plantland is just about a mile from where I am in Evergreen. Additionally, if you're interested, you can buy a pipe bender. So it's a jig that you can attach to like something sturdy, and you can go buy some common fencing materials from like Mild Fence, like chain link top rail material, and you can actually bend that with your jig and make some nice hoops. So that would be probably the most affordable option without just buying a kit from someone. Good question.
And Whitney wanted to say that you are awesome and happy birthday.
Oh, thank you.
Really, not really a question. And then Angela says, every year my cucumber plants do horribly. They never mature in time. Any tips for planting indoors, a date for planting indoors, and the best way to grow them once planted outside? Hoop house or outside, shaded or not?
Yeah, cucumbers are a warm weather plant, and so if you have the option of growing them in a hoop house or something, I definitely would. With that being said, cucumbers do just fine outside as well. What I can recommend for cucumbers, we start our first succession of cucumbers, I believe, in like May 1st, and we plant them. This year is a 128 cell. We also have 50 cells. So the 50 cell, they're quite a bit bigger, and cucumbers grow very, very quickly. So they're only going to spend about 2 weeks growing in a 50 cell tray. And when you go to plant the cucumbers, they really don't like they're very sensitive about their roots. So we never pot up cucumbers. So trying to pot them up in a bigger pot, do not do that. go from a decently sized pot or cell straight into the ground. And then I think what happens is a lot of people plant their cucumbers too early, and a lot of these warm weather crops will almost not respond to being planted if the soil is still too cold. So, you know, starting them May 1st and planting them in our greenhouse in mid-May, if you're planting them outside, I would push that back 2 or 3 weeks. And from there, you know, there's a variety of things that can go wrong at that point in the cucumber's life. But as far as getting them out in the field or in your garden, you know, if you're planting them early June, mid-June, that should be pretty good.
Awesome. And Lauren asked, she says she inherited a greenhouse with a large raised bed. Can she grow peppers and tomatoes directly in the greenhouse?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, the thing about raised beds is much like the soil out in your garden or the soil out in my field, is that it needs to have the right nutrients. And so make sure you're applying some sort of compost or some sort of low strength organic fertilizer. Don't use any of the like Miracle Grow nasty stuff. Fertilizer on a basic level is rated NPK. So it might, and that's nitrogen and potassium, and it might, some of the nasty stuff might be a really high number, like 50, 50, 50. You really want to find like an organic fertilizer or compost that's rated like 2, 3, 2 or something like that. If you wanted to get super hardcore, you could get a soil test for your raised bed in your greenhouse. But, you know, I think if you're amending it with a little bit of fertilizer, and there's other things you can do too to improve your soil health. But yeah, tomatoes and peppers love to be indoors, especially in Montana.
And that looks like all of our questions. So Nathan, thank you so much. We had a lot of response in the chat saying how much they appreciated and learned so much and thought you were fabulous. So thank you. Oh, somebody's raised their hand. Helen, can you type something in the chat? Oh, here we go. Oh, someone just said thank you. And yes, so maybe they just wanted to thank you. With that, thank you all for coming. This is our last session of Free the Seeds. Thank you for wrapping us up, Nathan. We appreciate you sharing your expertise. Just a reminder that if you are interested in donating, there's a link in the chat. And we once again want to thank our sponsors, Box of Rain and Save Farmland, and all of you. So thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to seeing you next year in person at FECC. And we will also plan to do a couple in-person workshops this spring, summer, and fall. So if you're interested, you can go to Land to Hand MT and sign up for our mailing list if you're not already on it, and you'll get information about those upcoming workshops. And with that, thank you all and have a wonderful evening.